The Venezuelan regime suffered one of the worst weeks in its history after the extradition of former National Treasurer Claudia Diaz because of the death of retired General and former Defense Ministry Raul Badwell, and especially because of the extradition of Colombian political operator Alex Saab. So these are the three worst case scenarios that the Venezuelan regime could suffer in a short period of time, considering the damaging consequences that this situation could bring for Caracas and for the dictatorship of Nicolás Maduro. On the one hand, the case of Claudia Diaz. She used to be one of the most loyal members of the Chavismo and one of the main figures besides Venezuelan former dictator Hugo Chavez, to the point that she became his personal nurse during the time he was dying of cancer and he was treating himself for cancer. After that situation, Claudia Diaz became the national treasurer and she was involved in pretty damaging, pretty horrible corruption cases in Venezuela, of course, cases where there were many other members of the regime who were also involved. However, she decided to escape to Spain, where she essentially lived a pretty luxurious life, the Dolce Vita, essentially. And she was being called by the Venezuelan regime to be extradited. The Venezuelan regime was asking Spanish authorities to extradite Claudia Diaz to Venezuela. Of course, many political analysts believe that the reason behind this request from the Venezuelan regime was essentially to silence Claudia Diaz and prevent the consequences that her declarations to foreign authorities will bring. So, unfortunately for the Venezuelan regime, she was extradited to the US. On the other hand, the death of retired General and former Defense Minister Raul Badwell. This situation took place a couple of days after the extradition of Claudia Diaz. And of course, this was quite damaging as well because, we need to remember that of every single type of crisis that Venezuela is experiencing, because Venezuela is experiencing a widespread crisis, of all the type of crisis that the South American nation is suffering, one of the worst and the most famous is the one of the political prisoners. The amount of political prisoners that are in Venezuela, and of every single political prisoner, probably the most famous of all has always been Raul Badwell. Especially because we need to remember that Raul Badwell was one of the main figures of the Venezuelan revolution. He was probably the most loyal member of the Venezuelan regime, to the point where former dictator Hugo Chavez picked him as defense minister, where he always showed full support. This situation came to its end after Badwell started to criticize the Venezuelan regime because of the authoritarian paths it was taking. After that moment, the Venezuelan regime essentially decided to put him in jail. And he died in jail. He died as a political prisoner. So, of course, in terms of image and in terms of increasing the pressure of the international community, this is the worst thing that could happen to the Venezuelan regime, especially a couple of days after the scandal of Claudia Diaz. However, things got incredibly worse for the Venezuelan regime, considering that basically a couple of hours after the death of Raul Badwell, it was known that the Cape Verde's authorities approved the extradition of Colombian political operator Alex Saab to the United States. This was probably the worst nightmare for the Venezuelan regime, because we need to remember that Alex Saab is a political operator from Colombia who the Venezuelan regime essentially picked as the person who was going to conduct all types of illegal operations to basically create different type of illegal oil businesses between Venezuela and many other companies and many other countries around the world. the reason why we're talking about illegal oil businesses is because we need to remember that the oil industry of Venezuela was sanctioned by the Trump administration, and the Biden administration essentially maintained those sanctions, which makes illegal for the Venezuelan regime to conduct oil operations and oil businesses with other nations around the world. So the person who was essentially conducting all these operations, who were creating all these shady businesses, was Alex Saab. And in addition to this detail, because we're talking about someone who knows basically most of the darkest secrets of the Venezuelan regime, and in addition to this important detail, many reports from independent media points out that Alex Saab is actually the person who manages the money of dictator Nicolas Maduro. He is the one who has all that money, who knows the location of this money. And on the other hand, many reports from independent media also point out that a pretty large portion of this money comes from drug trafficking. So for the Venezuelan regime and for Nicolas Maduro, what happened to Alex Saab and the possibility that he could reveal a lot of damaging information to US authorities is essentially the worst case scenario. Reporting from Medellin, Colombia, Luis Orozco, Newsweek.